At 4:17 p.m. on July 20th, 1944, Sergeant Frank, the fixer, Kowalski, a man whose hands preferred the smell of high-octane gasoline over gunpowder, felt the familiar vibration of fear running through the hull of his M4 Sherman tank. They were 15 miles inland from St. Lay, pushing through thick hedgerows known locally as the bocage, killing field, where Allied armor was being gutted by invisible German guns. The sound that seized his attention wasn't an 88mm cannon, but the sharp, sickening thump of a nearby Panzerfaust rocket impacting the ground 50 yards to their starboard side. Kowalski wasn't an ordinary tank commander, or even an ordinary gunner. He was a disgraced master mechanic from Chicago, technically assigned to the Ordnance Department, but permanently attached to the Scrap Corps, an unofficial, highly volatile unit known formally as the 3rd Provisional Maintenance and Salvage Platoon. To the rest of the U.S. Army in Normandy, they were little more than glorified junk collectors. They scoured the wreckage-strewn countryside, harvesting usable parts from destroyed tanks and trucks. But the Scrap Corps was something else entirely. It was an unofficial asylum for the mechanically brilliant and the militarily insubordinate. Kowalski had been busted down from Chief Warrant Officer 3 months prior for repeatedly modifying government-issued engines to run faster, hotter, and louder than regulations allowed. His crewmates shared similar pasts. A corporal caught trading Jeep parts for cognac. A private who once wired a mess hall for impromptu explosives just to test the limits of its circuit breaker. The Army saw these men as liabilities, a collection of mechanical anarchists who refused to follow the manual. Their commander, Major General Hugh J. Gaffey, however, saw the escalating casualty rate of the M4 Sherman. The standard Sherman was, in 1944, a death trap against the heavily armored German Panthers and Tigers. The official Army solution was tactical superiority, mobility, numbers, and air support. But Kowalski and the Scrap Corps had their own solution: engineering arrogance. If the standard armor won't stop a shot, Kowalski famously muttered to his crew, "We'll make it stop." Their tank, Junk Heap, was the physical manifestation of their rebellion. It was an M4A1 that barely resembled its factory blueprints. Over the course of 6 weeks, operating under the cover of night and using salvaged welding gear powered by stolen truck batteries, Kowalski and his crew had transformed the vehicle. They scavenged thick steel plates, shirts, and skirts ripped from wrecked German Mark IVs, boilerplate from a bombed-out French factory, and even heavy tractor parts. They bolted, welded, and chained this extra mass onto every vulnerable surface: the glacis plate, the turret cheeks, and especially the sides. The result was a grotesque 35-ton monstrosity, an extra 4,000 pounds of non-standard, poorly manufactured, mismatched metal bolted haphazardly to the frame. Field commanders called it reckless, citing concerns about stressed transmissions, decreased top speed. It maxed out at a grinding 18 miles per hour, and the terrifying possibility that a sharp impact would turn their improvised armor into lethal shrapnel flying inward. But for the men inside, the rough, ugly layering offered a psychological shield that the standard paint job could not. This was survival engineering taken to its tactical extreme. Now, as the Panzerfaust thumped nearby, Kowalski peered through his vision slot, the gritty stench of burning cordite heavy in the humid air. The 3rd Provisional Maintenance Platoon was not supposed to be leading the spearhead. They were supposed to be miles back, cleaning up the mess. But supply lines were choked, infantry was stalled, and the Germans were mounting a fierce armored thrust to reclaim ground near Hill 122. They had been pressed into service by an increasingly desperate major. "They're coming across the ridge, Sergeant," barked Corporal Reese, the gunner, his voice tight with adrenaline. 5 of them. Looks like Mark IVs, maybe a Panther lead. Kowalski gripped the tiller, his knuckles white. The Panther, Germany's most feared medium tank, carried the high-velocity 7.5 centimeters KWK-42 cannon. That gun was designed to punch straight through the Sherman standard 63 mm front plate at 1,000 yards. The distance to the ridge was 800 yards. This was the ultimate test. Was their scrap metal a brilliant, life-saving innovation forged from desperation, or just a heavy coffin ready to be crushed? Kowalski pressed the intercom. Reese, aim for the tracks on the Panther. Henderson, keep your eyes open for infantry support. And boys, Kowalski added, taking a deep, rattling breath of oily air, let's find out if this junk heap can take a hit. The lead German tank crested the ridge, its long cannon staring directly down the axis of the road. And then the first shell screamed towards them. It was 4:21 p.m. The incoming round from the Panther, a high-velocity 7.5 centimeters projectile, was a shrill, tearing sound that culminated in a sound Sergeant Kowalski would forever describe as the world trying to break a diamond hammer. It struck the front right quadrant of the junk heap's glacis plate at 4:21 and 30 seconds. A standard M4 Sherman, hit at this range by the Panther's gun, would have been dead instantly. The shell would have punched through the 63.5 millimeters of standard armor like a needle through cloth, spraying molten steel and superheated gas, a phenomenon called spalling, inside the cramped fighting compartment, incinerating the crew in less than a second. But this was no standard Sherman. The round slammed into the top layer of scavenged boilerplate, a quarter-inch of rough, non-standard steel that Kowalski had affixed using heavy-duty bolts and thick, uneven welds. This exterior layer, crudely angled, absorbed the initial kinetic energy. The shell, attempting to penetrate, fractured the scrap metal. This caused a critical delay in the fuse arming. Instead of sailing through, the projectile struck the primary hull armor seconds later. Its velocity significantly diminished. The tank bucked violently sideways, throwing the crew against the padding. Inside, lights flickered out, replaced by a blinding flash and a thick cloud of acrid smoke that smelled of burned rubber and ozone. Private Henderson, the assistant driver, screamed, "Impact! We took a hit, front right. Hold fire." Kowalski roared over the ringing in his ears, struggling to remain vertical. Reese, the gunner, was rubbing his eye, having slammed his head against the scope protector. Kowalski, we're still in one piece. We're still running. The realization was a massive, terrifying wave of elation. The scrap armor had not failed. It had done its job. It had prematurely detonated the high-velocity round, dissipating enough energy to prevent total penetration. The internal armor remained intact, though the impact left a deep, searing crater and dislodged a thick chunk of scrap armor that clattered uselessly onto the muddy road. "Damage report," Kowalski demanded. "Driver's fine, track scene's good, hull integrity nominal," reported the driver, shaking off the shock. At 4:22 p.m., Kowalski made the critical decision, a choice entirely against the official U.S. Armored doctrine, which emphasized overwhelming fire superiority. They know we're here now, and they know we survived. "That Panther is lining up its next shot," Kowalski said, his voice now dangerously calm. "We don't trade blows with a Panther. We paralyze it." He leaned into the microphone. "Reese, forget the hull. Load HVAP and hit the running gear. Give me 2 rapid-fire shots into its right drive sprocket. Kill its mobility." The high-velocity armor-piercing, Vapier, rounds were precious cargo, reserved for close-quarters tank duels. They were smaller, faster, and used a tungsten carbide core, capable of punching through thinner armor plates, like those protecting the Panther's tracks and transmission housing. The German Panther, sitting motionless, seemed momentarily confused by the absence of an immediate counterstrike or explosion. It began traversing its turret, searching for the exact point of impact on the M4. Before the German gunner could acquire a clean sight picture, Kowalski yelled, "Fire! Now!" The 75mm M3 cannon of the junk heap roared twice in rapid succession. The muzzle flash briefly illuminated the dusty turret. The first HVAP round sliced through the 800 yards of space in an instant, striking the Panther's right drive sprocket, the geared wheel that pulls the track at its most vulnerable point. The impact was audible even over the roar of the M4's engine. A shower of sparks erupted, and the round shattered the sprocket casing, jamming the delicate gear mechanism. The second round, fired a heartbeat later, slammed into the tracks just above the road wheels, ripping a long section of the metal track clean off the tensioning wheels. At 4:23 p.m., the Panther was immobilized, a 45-ton monument of German engineering frozen in the middle of the road. It could still fight, its formidable guns still functional, but it could no longer maneuver or retreat. The German tankers, realizing they were exposed, now faced an impossible dilemma: hold their position and fight a static battle against unseen American forces, or bail out into the surrounding bocage, risking American infantry fire. Kowalski smiled grimly, the metallic taste of adrenaline in his mouth. One down. Henderson, swing us 20 degrees port. Reese, mark IVs are closing fast. Aim center mass. They're softer targets. Let's show them what real scrap metal can do. The immobilized Panther was now a lighthouse drawing German attention. 2 Panzer IV AUSF H medium tanks, following close behind the Panther, accelerated rapidly, attempting to fan out into the thick scrub to flank the American position. The terrain, however narrow lanes bordered by towering, earthen hedgerows 10 to 15 feet, high limited their maneuverability. This was the geometry of the bocage chaos. Every road was a narrow canyon, and every turn concealed a potential ambush. At 4:24 p.m., the 1st Panzer IV fired a quick, inaccurate round that sailed high over the junk heap, clipping the leaves of an ancient oak. Kowalski's M4 was already moving, exploiting the brief window created by the Panther's immobility. He ordered the driver to keep the throttle pinned, closing the distance to the 2 Panzer IVs from 700 yards down to 500 yards. Closing the distance mitigated the accuracy risk for his own gunner. Reese, and crucially, reduced the velocity and penetration capabilities of the German rounds by forcing them into a closer engagement angle. Target the lead Mark IV, center mass, standard at P, Kowalski commanded. If we're lucky, we hit the ammo racks. The Panzer IV, while still formidable, carried the 7.5 centimeters KWK 48 gun powerful, but less effective against sloped armor than the Panther's long 75 millimeters. The junk heap's heavily modified, unevenly welded frontal armor now gave it an unpredictable advantage. The layers of scrap metal created countless angles and air gaps, defeating the German tank's precision engineering. Reese fired. The shell hit the Panzer IV right on the driver's plate. Unlike the non-penetrating glancing blow the junk heap had endured, the standard U.S. armor-piercing AP round ripped through the thinner German plate. A bright plume of fire erupted from the Panzer's front, momentarily silhouetting the crew trying desperately to escape the inferno. One German tank down. The 2nd Panzer IV, realizing the danger, swerved sharply, almost colliding with the abandoned Panther, and began reversing quickly back toward the ridge line. He's breaking contact. Henderson, traverse the point 50 cal. Keep their heads down, Kowalski yelled. Henderson, manning the heavy Browning M2 machine gun mounted atop the turret, opened fire. The heavy 50 caliber rounds tore into the armor plate of the retreating Panzer, causing no serious damage, but forcing the German commander to keep his head down inside the cupola, effectively blinding the tank. But while Kowalski's improvised engineering had given him a tactical edge against the armored column, the Germans still had infantry support, the unseen enemy that made the bocage so lethal for tanks. At 4:26 p.m., A barrage of anti-tank rifle fire, perhaps from hidden Fallschirmjäger German paratroopers, erupted from the hedgerow immediately to the right. The rounds, probably 7.92 mm KPZ, B-39 anti-tank rifle rounds, were not designed to penetrate the Sherman's main armor, but they were deadly against vision ports and the engine compartment vents. One round ricocheted violently off the welded scrap armor on the turret cheek. A loud clang, followed by a high-pitched whine. Then, another barrage slammed into the side of the tank. The improvised defense held. The Germans were wasting precious ammunition trying to punch through metal that shouldn't have been there. Kowalski knew they had mere minutes before the immobilized Panthers' crew recovered, or the 2nd Panzer IV returned with reinforcements. The key to survival was eliminating the static threat immediately. Reese, high explosive load he. Kowalski barked. The Panther. Turret base. We finish this fast. The use of high explosive he against a static heavy tank was usually a waste of a shell. But Kowalski wasn't aiming for penetration. He was aiming for catastrophic mechanical failure. A well-placed he shell at the narrow gap between the turret and the hull could potentially jam the turret ring, incapacitating the main weapon and turning the tank into a massive, immobile bunker. At 4:27 p.m., the junk heap fired its final decisive round. The shell struck precisely where the German turret joined the hull. The high explosive detonated, not penetrating the thick steel, but generating massive shock and pressure. A terrible grinding sound was heard as the force buckled the metal and twisted the delicate bearings of the turret ring. The 75 mm gun of the Panther was permanently stuck, facing forward. The immobilized Panther was now truly defeated. The crew bailed out, desperately scattering into the dense hedgerows, carrying their MP40s and hoping to avoid the furious fire from Henderson's .50 caliber machine gun. The junk heap had survived the initial armored thrust. The cost was 2 German tanks destroyed, 1 severely damaged, and 30 rounds of various calibers, proving the worth of Kowalski's unorthodox, ugly, and illegal scrap metal armor. But the victory was temporary. Kowalski's unit was now 500 yards ahead of the main American line, exposed, running low on Havap, and surrounded by unseen German infantry, determined to avenge their lost armor. He had won the first battle, but the war, for the scrap corps, was just beginning. The battle ended as quickly as it began. By 4:35 p.m., the only sounds were the crackling flames from the destroyed Panzer IV and the rhythmic clanking of the junk heap's tracks, as Kowalski cautiously advanced another 100 yards to secure a critical crossroads. They were in uncharted territory, literally and tactically. The immediate threat was gone, replaced by the crushing weight of their precarious position. Kowalski, we need to consolidate. Command is still half a mile back. We can't hold this spot alone, Reese urged, reloading the main gun's racks with the remaining supply of he rounds. We can't go back, Reese, Kowalski stated, studying his tattered map, which showed the location of a vital, undefended German observation post, beyond, 3 miles further down the road. We just opened a hole in their line. If we pull back now, they seal it up and we wasted the Panther. The plan changes. We punch through and take the AP. If we can knock out their eyes, we break the entire local defense. This was the crux of the scrap corps' mentality. Never follow the manual. Always exploit the weakness. A retreat was safe, but strategically useless. Pushing forward was insanity, but potentially decisive. Before they could fully commit to the forward movement, however, the tank began to cough. The engine sputtered. The distinctive growl of the Continental R975C1 radial engine, replacing the smooth thrum with an erratic, threatening rhythm. Engine sounds choked, Sergeant, reported the driver, his voice tight. Losing pressure. Maybe overheating? Kowalski cursed under his breath. The crude, heavy scrap armor had done its job absorbing rounds, but the extra weight nearly 2 tons, had placed immense strain on the engine and transmission, which were already prone to failure in the punishing heat and dust of the Normandy summer. The tank's mechanical heart was rebelling. At 4:40 p.m., the engine died completely. Silence descended, heavy and absolute, broken only by the distant rhythmic pounding of artillery far to the west. Kowalski ripped open the hatch and vaulted onto the engine deck, scrambling over the improvised armor plating. The immediate diagnosis was terrifyingly simple. The fuel system was contaminated. The violent shaking from the impact, combined with aggressive driving through dust and mud, had likely stirred up sediment in the fuel tank, overwhelming the already stressed fuel filter. If they stayed put, they were dead. The German counterattack was only a matter of minutes away. They needed fuel flow, and they needed it now. Kowalski had no spare filter element designed for a standard M4. This was a classic survival engineering dilemma, a critical failure with no standard solution in the middle of a hot zone. He scrambled back inside, retrieving a toolkit and a roll of industrial-grade cloth tape. "Henderson, what's your job?" Kowalski asked, his eyes scanning the interior of the driver's compartment. "Assistant driver, loader." "And general screw-up, sir," Henderson mumbled, still shell-shocked. "You're a mechanic now," Kowalski said, his voice sharp and focused. "Get me the field dressing kit, the spare sterile bandages." Henderson retrieved the metal box containing medical gauze and field dressings, utterly confused. "We can't filter the fuel through cotton, Kowalski. It'll dissolve," Reese protested. "Not cotton gauze, you idiot. The sterile outer wraps. The cotton is for wounds. The wrap is tightly woven linen. It's finer than the official filter mesh," Kowalski explained, already unscrewing the housing for the clogged filter element. His hands, though rough, moved with surgical precision. The improvised plan: bypass the unusable, clogged filter entirely and replace it with a temporary field-expedient filter made of tightly folded medical linen. The linen had a small enough weave to catch the large sediment particles that were blocking the line, but was absorbent enough not to immediately block the flow of high-octane gasoline. It was a desperation measure. It would likely reduce fuel pressure, strain the pump, and could fail violently, but it was their only chance to restore mobility. At 4:48 p.m., with the sound of incoming German mortar fire suddenly intensifying 400 yards behind them, Kowalski jammed the jury-rigged linen filter into the housing, tightened the bolts, and slapped the hood. "Driver, ignition. Pray to whatever mechanical god you believe in." The radial engine coughed violently, a shuddering, metallic death rattle before finally catching hold. It settled into a rough but persistent idle. The makeshift linen filter was working, providing just enough flow to keep the massive engine alive, though Kowalski could hear the strain in every revolution. "We have propulsion, but we're running rough. Top speed is maybe 15 miles per hour, the driver reported at 4:51 p.m. "And that linen won't last 10 minutes. Kowalski knew the clock was ticking, both mechanically and tactically. The German mortar were getting closer. The explosions were now visible through the vision ports, impacting the hedgerows 200 yards back. The enemy was adjusting their fire onto the crossroads. The junk heap had to move, and it had to move forward. Retreat meant exposure and destruction. Forward, full speed. "We're aiming for that high ground 3 miles out. Grid reference 44 Sierra," Kowalski commanded, stabbing his finger at the map. The M4 groaned under its heavy, improvised armor, crawling slowly down the narrow, sunken lane. The scrap corps was now executing the riskiest maneuver of the entire day. A deep penetration mission using a crippled tank, purely based on Kowalski's engineering insight and disdain for standard operating procedure. For the next 10 minutes, they advanced, their progress excruciatingly slow. Every noise in the bocage sounded like a hidden ambush. At 5:05 p.m., they reached a point where the sunken lane opened slightly into a small field. This should have been a relief, but the field was unnervingly empty. "Wait, stop!" Kowalski yelled, slamming his fist on the hull. The driver ground the tank to a halt. Reese leaned over the commander's shoulder, looking through the sight. "What is it, Sarge?" "I don't see any German fire." "Exactly," Kowalski hissed. "It's too quiet. Look at the mud, 30 yards ahead of us." Kowalski had spotted the subtle, nearly invisible sign of military engineering, a series of small, barely disturbed mounds of earth, spaced in an unnatural pattern leading across the field. Standard German doctrine demanded the aggressive use of anti-tank mines to protect key approaches. The Americans had expected these minefields on the main arteries, but not in this seemingly insignificant field. The field was seeded with Teller mines heavy, circular anti-tank mines containing 12 pounds of high explosive, designed to destroy tank tracks and bellies. Hitting one would instantly detonate their fuel supply and ammunition. This presented an entirely new dilemma, a static minefield that blocked their only route to the observation post, with a motor column of German reinforcements surely approaching from the rear. Dilemma. 1. Attempt to reverse. Too slow, risk being pinned down by German mortar and anti-tank teams now converging on their rear. 2. Attempt to bypass. The bocage walls flanking the field were too high, 15 feet, and too dense to break through with a Sherman. 3. Attempt to clear the mines. Kowalski was a mechanic, not a combat engineer. They lacked the specialized grappling hooks or explosive lines. Clearing them manually meant exposing the crew and certain death from snipers. Kowalski looked at the Teller mine pattern. They were spaced approximately 12 feet apart. He glanced at the weight distribution of the junk heap. The extra scrap metal, initially added for protection, was now their greatest liability, increasing their ground pressure. "How wide is a standard mine lane, Reese?" Kowalski asked the gunner. "They usually leave a narrow track for their own traffic, 10 to 12 feet, maybe," Reese replied. "They didn't leave a lane. They laid the field to deny the approach to the hill," Kowalski countered. He took a heavy breath. This was sheer, mechanical insanity, the kind that got men shot or court-martialed. "We're not going through the gaps. We're going over the mines," Kowalski declared. Reese stared at him in disbelief. "Sergeant, are you suggesting we drive a 35-ton tank directly onto a Teller mine? It's guaranteed death." Kowalski had spent weeks welding extra armor to save their lives from incoming shells. Now, his only option seemed to be to sacrifice the tank and his crew to a massive internal blast. But the scrap cores had a unique advantage that official armor doctrine missed: a specific weakness in the Teller mine design that Kowalski, the obsessive mechanic, had read about in a captured technical manual months earlier. Want to know if Kowalski's deep knowledge of German anti-tank mining could save the junk heap from certain detonation? Hit that like button right now. It tells the algorithm this story matters and helps more people discover the untold engineering brilliance on the front lines. Subscribe for more untold World War II stories. Back to Kowalski and the minefield. At 5:07 p.m., the junk heap sat motionless before the minefield, absorbing the distant sound of German 81mm mortar fire falling steadily closer. Sergeant Kowalski's plan was utter madness, rooted in an obscure detail of ordnance design. Kowalski's knowledge of the Teller mine, specifically the TMI-43 model, common in Normandy, was that it possessed a pressure plate fuse requiring between 450 and 660 pounds of pressure per square inch to fully compress and arm the detonator. The mine was designed to be pressure activated by the tank's track or primary road wheels, which concentrate the vehicle's weight. The German engineers, in their efficiency, always prioritize reliable arming over simple pressure, Kowalski explained, wiping sweat from his brow. They hate accidental detonations, which means they engineer a small, critical delay. The M4 Sherman, even with its heavy scrap armor, dispersed its 35 tons of weight over its broad tracks. While the overall weight was immense, the ground pressure exerted by the standard tank track was relatively low, around 13 pounds per square inch, psi. But a heavy tank like a Tiger, which runs around 57 tons, easily hits the psi requirement with its tracks, Kowalski continued. Our problem is the extra 2 tons of scrap. It increases the overall ground pressure, but not enough to trigger the mine, provided we hit it right. The decision was tactical suicide based on an engineering gamble. They would attempt to roll the entire tank directly over a teller mine, aiming for the center of the chassis, hoping to straddle the mine and avoid putting the concentrated weight of the road wheels directly onto the pressure plate. The tank's low undercarriage, however, meant the mine would pass within inches of the hull. Kowalski turned to the driver, a raw-boned kid named Pete. "Pete, you see that clump of dirt 30 yards out? I need you to aim the center of the track exactly 6 inches to the left of it. If we drift half a foot, we're charcoal. If we hit the mine directly with a road wheel, we're history. Do you understand?" Pete nodded, his face pale, gripping the steering levers with white knuckles. 6 inches left of the clump, Sergeant. Straddle the mine. At 5:09 p.m., the M4, running rough on its makeshift linen filter, began to move forward. Every foot of progress felt like an eternity. The rhythmic clanking of the tracks was suddenly the loudest sound in the world. Reese, standing half exposed in the turret, could clearly see the dark green disk of the teller mine, positioned exactly where Kowalski had predicted. It looked impossibly small, yet impossibly lethal. The massive front track slowly approached the mine. The tension in the crew compartment was suffocating. Every man was braced for the explosion that should have instantly followed. The track passed over the mine. The mine sat between the tracks, positioned almost perfectly beneath the heavily armored belly of the tank. There was a massive, sickening scrape of metal on metal, the sound of the mine as hard casing sliding against the lowest point of the tank's chassis, but no explosion. The mine had slid harmlessly past the main road wheels, touching only the reinforced belly armor, which was slightly raised and distributed the pressure too widely to activate the fuse. "We cleared it," Reese choked out, his voice hoarse with relief. "Don't celebrate, Reese," Kowalski snapped. "It was the first one. We have 15 more." The driver, gaining confidence from the initial impossible success, meticulously guided the junk heap over 3 more mines in a desperate, slow line. Each time, the tank scraped the top of the teller mine, the sound echoing through the cabin, but the fuse mechanism remained inactivated. By 5:15 p.m., they had successfully crossed the field, leaving a trail of untouched but exposed anti-tank mines behind them. The unorthodox, heavy frame and the high ground clearance of the M4, usually a disadvantage, had become their savior. They burst back onto the main track, engines sputtering, but still moving. They were now truly behind the German lines, having bypassed a crucial choke point. They had defeated the enemy's armor, neutralized their static defense, and escaped destruction through sheer mechanical know-how. Kowalski slammed his fist on the dashboard, a grim satisfaction washing over him. "See, Reese? Sometimes the weight of a few tons of junk is exactly what you need to survive. Now, find me the first German radio antennae you can spot. We're going to blind them." Now 4 miles behind the collapsing German front line, the junk heap moved cautiously, the engine struggling under the strain of the heavy armor and the failing linen filter. The atmosphere was eerily quiet, punctuated only by the distant sounds of battle and the sputtering protest of their radial engine. The objective was the observation post, AP, situated on Hill 122, a strategic crest providing Germans with sweeping views of the entire American forward movement. Kowalski's plan was to leverage the unexpected gap they had created and strike this target before the Germans realized a single American tank was operating in their rear. At 5:30 p.m., they began their ascent up the steep, Wooded slopes leading to Hill 122. The junk heap, already heavy, was struggling badly with the gradient. Smoke began to curl ominously from the engine bay, a clear sign that the improvised fuel filter was struggling, starving the engine and causing severe overheating. Engine temperature is critical, Sarge. We push any harder, we risk seizing the pistons, the driver reported, his voice tight with alarm. We're 500 yards from the summit. We stop now, we're surrounded by infantry, Kowalski replied, peering through the scope. He spotted a thin line of field telephone wire, strung carelessly between two small trees. They're close. They won't be expecting armor. Kowalski ordered a brief, brutal halt. Pop the engine bay. Henderson, get that cloth tape and the water canteens. We need a jury-rigged cooling system. While the crew desperately worked to cool the engine and replace the now shredded linen filter with an even smaller piece of cotton fabric, Kowalski studied the enemy's defenses. The AP was guarded by two small bunkers, visible just through the dense tree cover, and he could see the silhouette of a tall radio antenna, their primary target. Suddenly, a sharp metallic sound sliced through the air, the unmistakable click of a bolt being slammed home on a rifle. Down! Infantry! 3 o'clock, 100 yards. Reese yelled, swinging the turret towards the sound. A squad of German soldiers, perhaps a dozen men, had been moving through the woods and stumbled directly upon the stationary American tank. They were armed with standard carabiner 9.8K rifles and at least one MG-42 machine gun, but they lacked heavy anti-tank weapons. This was a classic tank versus infantry engagement in tight quarters. The tank's main gun was useless at this range, too slow to traverse and too high above the ground. Kowalski acted instantly. Henderson, suppressive fire, the .50 cal. Driver, full reverse, hit those trees 50 yards back. We need to break line of sight. A massive Browning M2 machine gun mounted externally on the turret roared to life. The heavy .50 caliber rounds tore into the woods, snapping small trees and spraying wood chips and dirt. This bought them precious seconds. The driver executed Kowalski's order, backing the tank violently into the dense woods. The rough, ugly exterior, all those improvised plates and bolts, did more than just stop shells. It created a jagged, uneven surface. The German infantry rounds, now aimed at the tank, struck the heavily armored hull, their 7.92 mm rounds incapable of penetration, merely leaving angry, shallow scratches on the scrap metal. As they reversed, Kowalski realized the infantry had not scattered completely. Two men were low-crawling aggressively toward the junk heap's vulnerable rear engine deck, carrying large canvas bags. Engine deck, they're trying to mine us. They have satchel charges. Kowalski yelled, the sound of the machine gun deafening. He did the only thing he could. He opened his hatch and, exposed from the waist up, grabbed two Mark II fragmentation grenades from the rack. Without calculating, he ripped the pins and lobbed them over the side of the turret, aiming blind at the movement he saw in the underbrush, less than 30 feet away. The twin explosions were immediate and deafening, spraying dirt and shrapnel into the air, and momentarily silencing the German rifle fire. The mechanical engineers had once again been forced to engage in brutal, close-quarters combat. The charge was steep, the engine was dying, and the enemy was now aware of their presence. They had survived the tank attack and the minefield, but the unseen infantry was determined to stop the scrap cores before they reached the summit. They were running out of time and out of luck. The two grenade blasts at 5:35 p.m. momentarily stunned the German patrol, giving Kowalski the critical window he needed. Scrambling back into the commander's seat, he ignored the driver's desperate pleas about the overheating engine. We're pushing through the infantry. Full throttle, Pete. We have to make the summit before they call in armor, Kowalski ordered. The junk heap surged forward, forcing its way through the dense underbrush and small trees. The remaining German infantry, realizing the sheer impossibility of stopping a moving tank with just small arms fire, scattered. The engine was screaming a high-pitched, metallic whine that meant certain mechanical failure was imminent. The oil pressure was dropping rapidly, and the makeshift linen and cotton filter was probably disintegrating into the fuel lines. At 5:40 p.m., they broke the tree line. The summit of Hill 122 lay just 70 yards ahead. The site was immediately clear. The observation post consisted of 2 log and earth dugouts, flanking a high wooden mast supporting a large radio antenna. This was the nerve center of the local German command. The men operating the radio, and manning the position perhaps, 20 total, were caught completely off guard by the sight of an American Sherman suddenly materializing deep behind their lines. The German soldiers scattered, some diving into the bunkers, others running towards stacked crates of supplies. Kowalski didn't waste a second on caution. This was a demolition run, not a defensive siege. Reese, high explosive. Target the base of the antennae mast. Henderson, 50 cal on the right bunker, suppressive fire. Pete, move us 10 yards to the left. Don't stop moving. The German defenders were too surprised to mount an organized resistance. A few riflemen tried to open fire, but the round simply glanced off the tank's ugly, scarred scrap armor. At 5:41 p.m., the junk heap fired its 75 mm main gun. The He round struck the base of the wooden radio mast with devastating effect. The mast snapped instantly, and the large radio antenna, critical for coordinating German counterattacks and relaying intelligence, crashed down in a tangle of wire and splinters. The Germans had been blinded. As the tank rolled forward, Henderson's heavy 50 caliber fire raked the entrance of the right dugout, shredding the sandbags and keeping the occupants pinned down. Rees immediately reloaded. The bunkers, Rees. Load AP and put 1 round through the center of each, Kowalski ordered. This was less about killing the occupants and more about eliminating the position as a functional command center. An AP round penetrating the log structure would cause maximum spalling and structural damage. The M4 fired again. The round ripped through the main observation bunker, followed by a dull internal explosion, likely cooking off internal ammunition or demolition supplies. At 5:43 p.m., the mission was complete. The observation post was destroyed, the German ability to coordinate their local defense crippled, and the strategic breakthrough Kowalski had envisioned was achieved. But the price was paid immediately. Engine seized. Sergeant, we're dead in the water. Oil pressure is 0, Pete yelled in a panic. The overworked, overheated radial engine finally gave up the ghost. A heavy, greasy smoke began pouring from the engine bay, smelling like burned metal and failure. The junk heap sat immobile on the summit of Hill 122, a scarred monument to engineering audacity. They were 5 miles behind the original front line, surrounded by furious German forces with a completely dead tank, 2 remaining rounds of ammunition, and no support. Kowalski knew the German reaction would be swift and brutal. They would be surrounded by heavy infantry and perhaps a desperate armored recovery team within the hour. Reese grabbed the shortwave radio. Try to raise command. Tell them we're on Hill 122. We completed the mission, but we need infantry support and recovery immediately. Tell them we're defending with what we have left. The scrap cores had defied physics, tactical doctrine, and German armor. Now, their last act of survival engineering was about to begin, turning their broken 35-ton wreck into an impossible fortress. The crippled M4 Sherman, junk heap, was silent, its engine smoke mingling with the smoke rising from the destroyed observation post on Hill 122. The time was 5:45 p.m. Sergeant Kowalski and his crew had about 45 minutes before. German forces could organize a coordinated counterattack capable of overwhelming their position. They were 4 men heavily armed, protected by several tons of improvised armor, but critically lacking mobility and heavy ammunition. Reese, attempting to use the tank's shortwave radio, an AN-GRC-3, found the transmission range inadequate for reaching the nearest American command post 5 miles away, especially with the elevation of the hill interfering with the signal. "Signal is too weak, Sarge. Maybe only 3 miles, Reese reported grimly. They won't hear us. Kowalski surveyed the perimeter. The summit was relatively clear, offering a good field of fire in most directions, but the surrounding woods offered perfect cover for advancing infantry. We don't wait for rescue, we force it, Kowalski decided. He immediately began preparing their last desperate act of engineering defense. They had 3 operational machine guns, the coaxial, 30 cal, the bow, 30 cal, and the turret-mounted, 50 cal. They also had a large supply of small arms ammunition, 12 fragmentation grenades, and the 2 remaining 75 mm main gun rounds, 1 AP, 1 He. Kowalski ordered the crew to empty every storage bin. They retrieved the standard array of tools, spare bolts, and, crucially, several small cans of spare diesel and gasoline kept for smaller auxiliary engines. His plan was simple and savage. Create a defensive perimeter using fire and distraction. First, they began using the .50 caliber to cut down small trees and branches, stacking them 20 yards out on the primary approaches. Then, they soaked the piles with the spare gasoline. Second, they began preparing an anti-personnel minefield using an improvised technique the scrap corps had perfected during training. They can trap. They used empty C ration cans, partially filled with dirt, and buried them just beneath the surface, tying thin wire, scavenged from the radio mast, between them, barely visible above the ground. The wires were connected to live fragmentation grenades, their pins partially pulled and taped into place. Any soldier tripping the wire would pull the pin, setting off the grenade. It was crude, time-consuming, and highly effective as a deterrent. At 6:05 p.m., the first German response arrived, a motorized patrol of perhaps 25 men, primarily infantry equipped with automatic rifles, and at least 3 Panzers, the German shoulder-fired anti-tank rocket launcher. They approached from the eastern slope, moving quickly and cautiously. Kowalski watched them through the periscope. They're checking for mines. Henderson, wait until they start fanning out. We hit them hard. The enemy commander, aware that the American tank was stationary, decided to use the standard tactic against immobilized armor. Divide the unit into 3 teams for a simultaneous flanking maneuver, utilizing the cover of the dense woods. As the German flanking teams began their wide sweep, the junk heap erupted with fire. The coaxial, 30 caliber chattergun barked continuously, followed by the heavy, rhythmic pounding of the .50 caliber, tearing into the advancing troops. The Germans, surprised by the sheer volume of fire, immediately took cover. But as the flanking teams pushed through the underbrush, the first set of can traps detonated. 2 sharp, concussive blasts were heard from the woods. Screams followed. The improvised defense had worked, causing confusion and casualties among the advancing infantry, forcing them to hesitate. But the Germans had their own answer. The Panzers team, having identified the approximate location of the turret, braced themselves and fired. The first rocket screamed towards the M4. It struck the rear of the turret, right where Kowalski had welded an extra layer of 1-inch thick, non-standard steel plate scavenged from a French girder. The impact was enormous, shaking the tank violently and causing temporary ringing in the crew's ears. The improvised armor held. A shaped charge warhead, designed to penetrate up to 200 millimeters of homogeneous armor, dissipated its force across the non-standard fragmented metal, achieving only a partial penetration and causing massive external damage, but sparing the crew. Kowalski realized they had bought minutes, perhaps an hour. But the Germans would keep coming. They had only 2 heavy rounds left, and the shortwave radio was useless. Their only hope lay in the audacity of their defense, forcing the Germans to report heavy resistance, hoping that report would draw the attention of the main American advance. Reese, load the he round. We wait until they clump up again. Henderson, set those stacks of dry wood on fire. Let's light up this hill and show them what they're dealing with. Kowalski commanded. At 6:15 p.m., the junk heap became a fortress of fire and steel, broadcasting its desperate struggle across the hostile French countryside. They were alone, exposed, but refusing to break. The resulting fire on the summit of Hill 122 created a thick, black smoke visible for miles across the Normandy front, a massive unintentional signal flare. As the flames illuminated the surrounding woods at 6:25 p.m., the remaining German Panzer team attempted one final desperate charge. Kowalski watched them approach. They were forced to expose themselves briefly as they navigated the burning debris and the complex wire traps. He waited until the 2 lead men came into a tight alignment, approximately 75 yards out. Reese, AP round. Fire at the center mass of the lead man. Use him as the fuse, Kowalski commanded, his voice raw. The last armor-piercing round roared from the barrel of the 75mm gun. The trajectory was perfect. It struck the lead Panzer operator, passed through him, and violently fragmented against the dense undergrowth behind him, taking down his spotter. The remaining rocket launcher team immediately broke and ran, abandoning their heavy weapons. The sheer, bloody-minded defense of the junk heap had forced the German command to drastically reassess the infantry resistance on Hill 122. At 6:40 p.m., the American shortwave radio, previously silent, crackled to life with garbled, desperate German commands. The enemy was coordinating a full battalion-sized assault, including 2 companies of mechanized infantry, to clear the fortified position on the hill. But those German commands were overheard. An intelligence officer monitoring German radio chatter miles behind the American lines received fragmented, panicked reports of a major, heavily armored American breakthrough near St. Lay, led by an unidentifiable, incredibly tough tank. This disinformation created by Kowalski's improvised engineering and desperate actions achieved the strategic goal. At 7:05 p.m., a full company of the U.S. 2nd Armored Division, diverted by the panicked German radio intercepts, arrived at the base of Hill 122. They quickly ascended the eastern slope, meeting little organized resistance. They found the 4 men of the scrap corps Kowalski, Reese, Henderson, and Pete exhausted, covered in grime and cordite, but miraculously alive, standing guard over their shattered, smoking tank. The junk heap, scarred by 30-plus impacts, was motionless but intact. The M4A1, Sherman modified by Kowalski's illegal ingenious, scrap metal armor and kept alive by a medical linen fuel filter, had not only survived a direct engagement with heavy German armor and a minefield, but had created the decisive breakthrough necessary for the American advance. The men of the scrap corps, previously regarded as insubordinate liabilities, were suddenly tactical heroes. The captured Hill 122 was secured that night, significantly accelerating the breakout from Normandy. Sergeant Frank Kowalski's tank modifications were deemed too dangerous for widespread use by U.S. Ordnance Command, but the lessons of improvised external protection were quickly adopted by field mechanics across the theater, paving the way for officially sanctioned modifications like the sandbag armor and later spaced armor designs. The scrap corps, though eventually disbanded, became a legend among mechanics, the men who knew that sometimes the only way to beat the enemy's engineering was with sheer, ugly American improvisation. If this story of engineering survival and defiance moved you, don't just click away. Hit like, hit subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Are you in the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, or somewhere else? Our community stretches across the world. Did any of your relatives serve in World War II, especially in the Normandy theater? Tell us their story in the comments. Sergeant Kowalski and the men of the scrap corps paid the price for innovation and freedom. All we're asked to do is remember, like, comment, and share to keep their story alive. Never forget.